All right, it's time to get structured. It's time to get organized. All right, it's time to get organized. We've been playing around with a lot of informal design. It's now time that we think about putting a little bit of structure into our designs. So let's talk a little bit about structure. The purpose of structure is obviously we need to impose a certain amount of organization on the chaos of text and images. So every time we've got a layout of some kind, we have, you know, a lot of different pieces of content and we need to organize it. So a structure creates opportunities to make hierarchy. It'll help provide visual paths so that our eyes will jump from place to place in a kind of organized fashion. And it also relates the content by size, proportion, and spatial configuration. So it provides that opportunity to make everything look like it's playing in the same game in a very organized manner. It also provides layout consistency between multiple pages in a document, for example, brochures, magazines, or books, and that's what we're going to be dealing with in this project, is trying to get the consistency so that the design looks organized from spread to spread throughout the publication. It also provides layout consistency between different kinds of products in a series. For example, if you have an advertising campaign and then you have points of purchase, branding components, and if you have a grid that unifies all these elements, it makes everything look unified. It also provides a common layout reference for teams who are working on various types of production. For example, magazines and periodicals are, very large documents, right? Hundreds of pages sometimes, and many people will be working on these on different parts of these documents, and so a grid will help everybody to stay organized so that all the pages will fall together and look like they were planned that way. Also, it accommodates the requirements for printing and finishing processes by specifying printing and non-printing areas, finishing instructions, folds, scoring, perforations, and trim marks. So these are things that you would be dealing with, obviously, in a more advanced class where you would be dealing with actually sending things to a printer that would be printed in offset lithography on a printing press. So those are all different reasons for having structure. Joseph Mueller Brockman, one of the founding and probably one of the most famous designers at the Bauhaus, says this about the grid system. And the important thing to realize is that, as he says, it's an aid, it's not a guarantee. And basically, it's a tool, and you need to learn how to use it. And I would have to say that I really was averse to grids because I was never taught how to use them. And so now that I understand, I'm going to help you to understand how to do that. And it requires practice, just like anything that we've been doing in this class. You need to practice to get good at it. So it's the visual embodiment of structure. It's basically a grid of horizontal and vertical lines, and the intersections provide spatial modules where we put stuff. And it also provides a visual framework that allows us to actually build the pages. So this is what the parts of a grid are. So for example, here we've got margins, right? So margins run around the outside edge of the document. We have flow lines. Flow lines are important concepts to understand because they provide visual continuity as you flip pages. And so if you have content that drops below the flow line and content that is placed above the flow line, and the flow line is never bridged, then it provides a really kind of a very cool way of keeping everything organized. We have columns just like we have in HTML. We have rows, so, and we also where these intersect, we end up with these small elements called modules. And if we combine modules together, we get what's known as spatial zones. Okay, so those are the primary grid components that we'll be dealing with primarily. As well, we have a few other terminology things that we will want to talk about. Trim marks or crop marks are the little hack marks that are in the corners, indicating if the page is being printed on an oversized piece of paper, then that's where the page gets trimmed. This will happen in most publications because you're going to be trimming the entire document so that it looks like it's got all, it's all nice and tidy on all the edges. And so it's oversized. Okay, so running heads are places where you might have, for example, sometimes the chapter title will be up here, and as the chapter runs through, that little running head will always be there. We talked about margins, but they actually have some actual delineations. A head margin is at the top. The forage margin is on either the right or the left side, depending on what side of the page it is. So it would be on the outside of the page. The binding margin is where we run into the gutter. The gutter is where the two pages come together. Now, you're going to run into a couple of terminology issues here, similar to what we were talking about way back when we were playing around with the type forms themselves. And we can all blame this on Microsoft because they were the first ones to develop a digital tools for printing, and Microsoft Word and so on. And they started calling alleys, which is the space between the columns, they were calling those gutters, and they're not gutters. The gutter is the binding edge where two pages are attached together, and that's the gutter. Okay, so when you see that word gutter, that's what it means. It doesn't mean alley, which is the space between the columns. Okay, then we have two text columns. If something moves outside of the trim mark, it's called a bleed. Okay, a folio is usually a page number, but it also can be a chapter header or something like that. And then we have a foot margin, which is the margin at the bottom. So those are the parts of the grid that you're going to be wanting to consider. Okay, so we have different types of structure. We have informal, which is you just put stuff down on the page and make it look good. And then we have implied structure, which is an informal structure that's been tightened up with alignment. We have semi-formal grids, which are divisions based on proportions. And then we have formal grids, which are based on the mathematical subdivision of the page itself. We also have within any of these structures, we have active structures, inactive, visible, and invisible. And so active means it's rigidly adhering to the structure. You can't break out of it. Inactive suggests but doesn't dictate. Visible means the grid is actually part of the design and can be seen, and an invisible grid is a structure that's there but cannot be seen. So you can have an active visible, active invisible, inactive visible, and so on. As well, you can have a semi-formal active invisible, right? So just keep in mind that these are the main types of grids, and then this is the way the grid is utilized, okay? So how do you design a grid? And we'll get into some grid ideas in a minute. But right now, we talked about the ability to provide consistency between multiple pages. Now, the grid should be appropriate to the content. In other words, if you make your grid too simple, it stifles creativity because you don't have enough options. If you make it too complex, then the divisions are arbitrary and it doesn't really create the sense of structure because you can put things anywhere. So basically, the type of content should drive your grid design. For example, if you have a lot of square images, it might suggest that you have a grid with square modules. If you have a lot of horizontal images, you might want a grid that has a lot of rows. You also, the amount of the content suggests how complex the grid would be. If you've got a lot of small elements, that might suggest a more stratified grid. In other words, more grid modules. And if you have fewer larger elements, that might imply a more simple grid with less stratification. So you have to look at your stuff, see what you have, and then decide the complexity and the style of the grid itself. So here's some different types of structure. Okay, so a manuscript grid is essentially a grid that you would use for like a book. So you've got a large area for your text. You got a running head, you got a footer, and a spread might look like this with larger margins at the gutter and thinner margins along the edges. As well, you could have it balanced, and you could have something more like a book, like a tabletop book, what are they called? Coffee table books, that have a lot of white space and smaller areas for text and or images. You can have multi-column grids, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, but 2-column grids, threes, offset columns, 4-column grids, and so on. So like I said, we'll get a little bit more into that in a minute, but I'm just talking about the types at the moment. And then we've got modular grids where you have a lot of squares and a lot of opportunities. You'll see these a lot in newspapers, in complex publications. And again, like I said, if you've got a lot of small bits of content, or you have a lot of content and you haven't determined what size it's going to be, better to design a grid that's fairly stratified so that you have a lot of options plus negative space. If you designed a grid that was too bold and you had a lot of content, you'd end up completely filling all your space. So you can see you've got a lot of variables, and the ability to control these variables is part of the practice that you get in terms of learning how to use a grid. Then we have hierarchical grids. You'll see these in web design, but you'll also see them in more arty type publications. So they aren't necessarily divided by spatial zones, and they're not mathematically subdivision of the space. It's basically more of an informal grid because it doesn't have those qualities. So let's take a look at different types of grids. Now, these would be all formal grids. They're based off of mathematical subdivisions of the space. So we got 4 rows, 2 columns. We got 3 columns and 6 rows and so on. So these would all be considered formal grids. Again, if you've got a lot of big stuff, it might be best to use a grid that's got only a few subdivisions. If you've got a lot of little ones, more stratified, right? So this would be what's known as a 9-part formal grid, and this is something that you might consider for this project. It's obviously formal grid, and there's actually surprisingly a lot of opportunities in a grid that is this simple. So for example, you can play around with some horizontals, some verticals, squares, and so on. And this would be what's known as an active grid. Once you use the module, you can't do anything else to that module. At the moment, the modules and the spatial zones are completely filled, but say you had an image that was vertical and you wanted to put it in one zone. So, in one module, you'd fill that part of the module, but you couldn't put anything else in here. You couldn't bridge that and then have like a little alley in here either, because that would break the grid, right? That's what active grids are for. Inactive grids suggest where things go, but don't adhere rigidly to it. So the same thing is true. You don't necessarily break the alleys by adding more content. Once you've used the module or the spatial zone, you don't intrude on the other spaces. So getting back to that little 9-part grid, these are some of the possibilities that you can do with that, and you can see that even with the simple structure, you have a lot of opportunities. Now, again, a lot of it has to do with the amount of content that you have, and some of these designs show that the content completely fills the grid, and in other places it doesn't. But these are some considerations as you start to think about your particular project. Here's a pretty complex formal grid. And you can see that a lot of things are happening. Some of the shapes completely fill spatial zones as well as the alleys. Some are rigidly adhering to the spatial zones. Some only partially hit the spatial zones, but also pass through some of the alleys. So these are decisions that you make as a designer Do I break through the grid and do I use the alley, or do I maintain a very rigid adherence and not do that? These are all decisions that you make as a designer. And again, this is how get to be good at this stuff. One of the most, I think, impressive uses of complex grid structure is the national park system. And I talked about multiple elements that span different kinds of formats and so on. And and the national park system has done a really, I think, excellent job. So you'll see that in all of their multiple types of publications, they use the same exact grid. And so no matter who designs these at what national park, they've got this graphic standard that's based off of that grid. And no matter what a designer does, it's going to feel like it's all organized and feels like it's all part of the same family. So this is a super important concept to keep in mind as we move through our multi-page document. Okay, so here's a good example now of dealing with typography in a grid. It's not like we always have pictures, right? A lot of times we have text, right? And so these are some things to think about. For example, when we have alleys, if you have an opportunity to end a paragraph at the bottom of an alley, consider yourself really lucky. And then you can break the next paragraph and put it into the next module, and you'll keep that flow line. Remember, I talked about flow lines, these horizontal breaks that pass from page to page to page, providing that linear flow so that your eye is invited to move horizontally through the different layouts. Here's something else to think about when you're thinking, well, how big do I make my title? Well, sometimes the title can simply be a bold version of the same weight. A bold version of the same font size. If you want to make it larger, sometimes it's good to just make it double. So if this was 12-point type, a 24-point title might look cool. If this was 12-point, then 36-point could be cool. So these are ways of keeping proportion in mind as you explore scale and hierarchy. We've been playing primarily with intuitive design up to this point. So now, like I said, it's time that we start thinking about how this works together. Here's a good example of a formal grid. And in this situation, the designer has chosen at times to break that grid. For example, this fills part of the module, and then this breaks through the module. Sometimes you have no choice. Sometimes you have to break over, and then you wouldn't necessarily put another line of text that might start here. In this case, the designer's chosen to use the upper part of that module to put a small subtitle that's related directly to the title itself. So that's something that, you can think about. Same thing here, using the alignment. Notice the asterisk. A lot of times weird little characters, like quote marks especially, can really throw off your alignment. And so very often you might decide to use the text as the alignment and let the quote mark or the other punctuation hang over the edge so that it doesn't make a weird little notch in there. So keep that in mind as you sort of play around with these things. Here we're dealing rigidly with the columns. And so these are, obviously nice, solid ways of handling complex content. As well, we have this thing what's known as a baseline grid. A baseline grid provides that visual continuity between columns of text. And so you always make sure that the baseline grid, your text in columns, is always aligned along the baseline. And the baseline comes from your from the X height, I should say the cap height, and the leading for the font size that you selected. So the baseline grid will have the size of the font size itself, as well as the leading or the line spacing between it. So if it's 12-point type and we have 2-point leading, that's called being set 12 on 14. If we have 4 points leading, it's 12 on 16, and so on. Keeping this in mind, adding line spacing or leading between your lines can often impart a sense of elegance, because as you add space between those lines, it opens up the body of text and allows it to breathe a little bit. So that's a very important concept to understand. And a lot of designers just kind of throw out the, it's 12 point and then it's got 2-point leading, and that's pretty much what they do because that's the default. But think about that. You can change that and you can make that look cooler. All right. As well, we've got a bunch of pieces parts of different elements that we have in typography. And so obviously we have headlines and we have subheads. These are all things that you already know about. Headers, we've talked a little bit about that. You've all dealt with tables at one form or another. Block quotes are something that if you've played around with HTML, you know that the block quote tag will indent the text a little bit. So if we look at where a block quote is, we'll see that it's indented a little bit on both the right and the left sides. And so these are useful for inline quotes that you don't want to necessarily put quote marks around. So these are kind of a fun way of handling that. As well, we have things like sidebars. Sidebars are fun because they are isolated from the text, usually with a color or a value or something, and it has information that's related to obviously to the article, but not part of the text itself. It's sort of like, hey, and by the way, this is something you might want to know about, as opposed to being part of the actual text itself. Okay, so sidebars are kind of fun. Keep those kinds of things in mind. Folios, again, are usually page numbers or something like that. List items are useful when you want to make certain pieces of information more important. If you put it into body text, you might lose the impact of what these different individual elements might mean. So list items or numbered lists are often very useful for doing that kind of thing. Pull quotes are awesome. Pull quotes are, something somebody said, or it's actually usually a quote, but it can be just part of the text that's been pulled out and emphasized. It's usually repeated. So the stuff that's in the pull quote is also part of the body text, but it's there to grab your eye, and it's usually something that's kind of pronounced. It's like, and then he said, let's go kill him, or something like that, right? And all of a sudden you're like, whoa, what is that? And then you want to jump in there and sort of figure out what's going on, and it pulls you in to the content. Callouts are kind of fun. If you've got something that is happening, say, in an image, and you want to say, hey, look at this over here, a little callout can do that for you. Captions, of course, are little notations that are identified specifically with usually an image. Okay, so these are all the different kinds of typographic possibilities that we have in terms of handling written content. So I want you to consider these types of treatments as you begin to work with your layouts. Okay, so that's essentially the typography in grids, and I hope you find this interesting.